name is Kline, and my title is Research Services Librarian here at Stetson University. Yes, it's a great story. I love to tell the story. I came to Stetson nearly 40 years ago. I know it's embarrassing, 40 years ago. I was 30 years old. It was June 1, 1976. So June 1, 2016 is 40 years. It's quite a run. So I grew up in Orlando, went to Boone High School, and graduated a long time ago. And I wanted to go out of state for college, so I went as far as I could get away. But then I came back. That's the nice thing about it, because I was working at the University of North Carolina at Asheville, my first library job after FSU Library School. And I saw the ad for Reference and Government Documents Librarian at Stetson University, DeLand, Florida. And I thought, that sounds like me, because it's kind of in my backyard. I knew about Stetson from before, but not much about Stetson. I had been on the campus, but only once. Anyhow, I jumped at the opportunity to apply, and thank goodness I was hired to be Reference and Government Documents Librarian. My first day was June 1, 1976. I remember it vividly. I even remembered some of the questions I was asked on that first day as a reference librarian. So that's how I came to Stetson, and I was very fortunate to have that job. And Stetson has been very good to me in professional development. Both my daughters are educated here. Stetson is a great place for me. I became increasingly interested in university history as I was responsible, ultimately, for the university archives, which are housed here in the library. So that really got me quite interested. Plus, it always comes back to people. Gilbert Lycan wrote the Centennial History of the University in 1983. We celebrated our 100th anniversary. And it's a wonderful book. I knew Dr. Lycan. He was a great scholar, taught in the history department. And so that period began my interest in Stetson history. And just simply because I've been here 40 years. My favorite story is the story of the Count and Countess of Santa Eulalia. Now, what would that have to do with Stetson? Well, that's the story. That's the key thing. You see, John B. Stetson, his first wife died, and he married a young woman whom he met at his church in Philadelphia way back in about the 1870s. I don't have my notes in front of me, but let's say it was a long time ago. He met this beautiful, talented woman named Elizabeth Schindler. She was from a little farming community in Indiana. So why and how did John B. Stetson, who at that time was one of the wealthiest men in America, in Philadelphia, how could he have met this woman, Elizabeth Schindler? Well, her uncle worked at the John B. Stetson Hat Company in Philadelphia. And she would go and visit her uncle in Philadelphia on summers. And it was a great thing for her to come to the big city, Philadelphia, big city, big deal. Well, Miss Schindler was a lady who was quite beautiful and quite talented musically. Indeed, she played the piano and she sang. And when she was visiting her uncle in Philadelphia, she sang in the choir of this Baptist church, where John B. Stetson, of course, was a pillar of the church. Well, he, along with everybody else, took notice of this beautiful young woman who just showed up one day singing beautiful songs. And he decided that because her uncle was working for him, that he might assist her with further music lessons. So he underwrote the cost of her to take piano and voice lessons in Philadelphia from a very good teachers. And so he was sort of a patron, you know. Their age difference was not insignificant. I think at that point she was only about 21, and he was probably a man in his late 40s, early 50s. And anyhow, a few years later, they got married. It's a very romantic story. And so she became Elizabeth Schindler Stetson. A few years later, John B. Stetson, having been associated with the university from the beginning, really, when it was Henry DeLand University, or DeLand Academy, and then DeLand University, John B. Stetson built a mansion for himself and his wife and family on Camphor Lane in DeLand. It's open now to the public. It's been beautifully restored, the Stetson Mansion. You really should go and do the Christmas tour there. It's wonderful. Anyhow, Elizabeth didn't particularly like living in the land because the climate was so radically different from what she was used to. I mean, in the summers it's pretty hot here, and there are a lot of mosquitoes. However, the reason John B. Stetson came to DeLand to begin with, and the reason he met Henry DeLand, and later John B. Stetson became the principal benefactor of this university, which then was named for him, is because his doctor said to him, you're suffering from arthritis. A good treatment for you is to be in a southern clime. Well, that's not really the best treatment for arthritis, but at that time it was assumed that would help him, help his arthritis. So that's why he came to the land, looked around, and made some investments and so on. Anyhow, John B. Stetson had a stroke while he was at his home in DeLand at Stetson Mansion. This was after he was married. And he died a few hours later, very sad. And so the president of the university escorted Mrs. Stetson and the remains of John B. Stetson by train back to Philadelphia where he was buried. Well, a few years later, Elizabeth Stetson, who by then would be one of the wealthiest women in America, she was courted by a man called the Count of Santa Eulalia, a man from Portugal. Santa Eulalia is an island off of Portugal. He was of the aristocracy, the old sort of dying nobility in Europe. You see, Europe was not kind to noble people of noble birth because politics was changing and there were democratic movements. But he was a count, and he courted Mrs. Stetson. He wrote letters, he was introduced by mutual friends, and eventually they were married. And she became the Countess of Santa Eulalia because she was married to the Count. And there are wonderful pictures of them at their wedding reception. It's a romantic story. And there's more to the story, but this is one of my favorite stories about Stetson because even though John B. Stetson died and she remarried later, she still was faithful as a benefactor to Stetson University because it was the legacy of her husband. Yes, the White House piano. I remember this story fondly because it really has to do with Bill Clinton, who was a classmate of mine at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He was the same year, graduated with me in 1968. I was not a close friend of Bill Clinton, but I did meet him, and he gave me some great advice, actually, which is part of this piano story. I transferred to Georgetown from another school. I had spent my freshman year at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, but I had always planned to go to the Wall School of Foreign Service, but at the last minute, as a senior in high school, I decided to go to Hopkins. And it's a great school. I probably should have stayed there, but the lure of Washington was too great. So I decided to transfer my sophomore year to Georgetown. Well, of course, when you transfer, you miss out on a lot. That freshman bonding year where everybody's in the dormitories, all that jazz. So I rented a room in a house near the campus and started to make my way into the culture of Georgetown University. And Bill Clinton was always running for office, student government, all those kind of things. And I met him in my sophomore year, introduced myself to him. He was the ultimate politician even then. And he asked me about, my backgrounds from Orlando, Florida, and so forth and so on. He said, well, it's tough, make a transition when you're a transfer student. Well, what did you do at Hopkins? Did you work in, sports, plays, whatever? I said, well, actually, I was a reporter on the Hopkins student newspaper. Oh, well, what you need to do is go see my friend McNally, who's the editor of the Georgetown paper, the Hoya, and tell him that I sent you over and you should write for the Georgetown newspaper. That's how you'll meet a lot of people and get plugged in. He was exactly right. It was the best thing in the world that happened to me. I really started writing some interesting stories and met a lot of people. Well, years later, of course, Bill Clinton became governor of Arkansas. Then he became a presidential candidate. And he decided once he became president that first year he was in office, it happened to be the 25th anniversary of the class of 1968. It was 83. I'm a little hazy on the dates. Anyhow, it was our 25th anniversary for graduating from Georgetown. So we invited at the White House all of the graduates of Georgetown, not just from the School of Foreign Service, but College of Business, the college, Institute of Language Linguistics, nursing, the whole bit. It was a big crowd. So we had dinner at the White House, dinner on the grounds, big tent in the back. He had Chubby Checker, he had all the old 60s rockers there. It was a great party. And then he topped that because then our 30th anniversary, he was still president in his second term. And this time it was upscale. Black tie, we got to go into the White House. We were before on just the ground floor. But this, we got to go to the East Room, very fancy. And so my wife and I went both times, of course. And on that second time, we were in the East Room and there was the grand piano, which is another whole story. But anyhow, the Marine who was playing the piano, Juilliard graduate, of course, playing Chopin. I mean, it's really cool. So I went up to the guy and I said, I wonder if you could let my wife take a picture of me just sitting here at the piano, you know. He said, sure, of course, sir, because they get this question all the time. So what he didn't know was when I sat down, I started playing Fly Me to the Moon. I realized I couldn't milk this too long, just in time for my wife to take a picture. And about 8 seconds later, I got back up and I didn't, because otherwise it would have been a little awkward. So that was a great moment for me. And indeed, I have pictures to prove it. And so I can say accurately that I played the piano in the East Room